How about them corn dogs, huh? Surprised some people last year, myself included. Not very many people picked LSU to win the West last year in the SEC with Brian Kelly's first year, coming off a couple of pretty bad years under Ed Orgeron after, of course, winning a national title with one of the best teams we've seen in a while in 2019. But that's what LSU did. They did win the West last year. They beat Alabama in the regular season and won the division. Now, they did lose the SEC championship game to eventual national champion Georgia, but still a much better season, a much better year than just about anybody, including LSU fans, if they're being honest, anticipated for Brian Kelly's first year in Baton Rouge. Went on to win their bowl game too, I believe against Purdue or some such like that. But I'm doing a series of schedule previews. Going to try to cover a whole bunch of teams. I've done 4 or 5 already. There's a playlist if you want to go back and look at which teams I've done so far. I think it's, was it Tennessee, Bama, Clemson, Texas, now LSU. I'm pretty much going in order from the Patreon page. I made a post over on the Patreon page about a week, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. Let me know what teams you want to see a schedule preview on. The good people over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. Shout out to everybody on the Uncle Lou Patreon page, by the way. You guys are the real MVPs. It's hard to make a college football channel work year-round with the off-season being so long. And I've said it before, but I probably don't say it enough. Without the support from all of you over on the Patreon page, I probably would not be able to do this as a full-time job year-round. So big shout-out to everybody over on the Patreon page. But next up on the list over there was LSU. So we're going to take a look at their schedule coming up for this year. I think you know how I do these by now, but kind of just comparing the upcoming schedule to last year's schedule. Is it harder or easier, right? So you look at the non-con games. Who do they play in the non-con this year versus last year? Is it an easier road or a harder road? In the conference games, of course, SEC, LSU, 8 conference games right now. That's expected to change soon, probably next year. But right now, 8 conference games, 4 non-con. So who's in the non-con? Is it harder or easier than last year? And when it comes to the conference schedule, who'd you draw from the opposite division? And as far as your toughest games, do you get them at home? Do you get them on the road? Are there any potential trap games? Where's your bye week? Is it in a good spot or not? Are there any tough, like back-to-back games or back-to-back road trips? Kind of just an overview of the schedule. I do prediction videos, but I do them later in the off season, sort of around the beginning of summer, May, June, July. We'll do some prediction videos, a bunch of them. But one of the things you have to know before you start predicting a team's record, right, is who they're going to play. Not only that, but who do they play? When do they play them? Where do they play them? I mean, all that kind of matters when it comes to doing record predictions and things like that. So doing all these schedule previews, believe it or not, does help me with those predictions. But let's talk about LSU coming up for 2022. I've got the schedule pulled up here. Now, just like last year, they start things off with what is technically a neutral site game against Florida State. This is a little bit unusual. Usually, when you play a team 2 years in a row, it's a home and home, right? Well, they didn't. They decided not to do that. These are both neutral site games. Last year, technically a neutral site game, played in New Orleans. LSU was in Baton Rouge. This year, a neutral site game played in, is it Orlando? Yes, Camping World Stadium. Florida State, of course, in Tallahassee. So last year's neutral site game in the same state as LSU. This year's neutral site game in the same state as Florida State. One of the best big non-con games of the year last year ended up being this Florida State LSU game. It was the Labor game last year, played on Monday night. It didn't get the attention it deserved heading into the season because both of those teams were coming off disappointing seasons and not a whole lot of expectations for either team heading into next year. That is not the case this year. I've got my top 10 on the bottom shelf here, or top 15, whatever it is. I've got LSU at 3. I know that's higher than everybody else. This is just a way too early preseason ranking. This is liable to change some before we move into the start of the season. I only do 3 preseason rankings. I do one after signing day, one after all the spring games, which will be coming up in about a month from now, and then I do a final preseason ranking late in the summer, a month or so before the season starts. So I've got LSU at 3. This was after signing day. I know that's higher than a lot of other people. I've got Florida State at, is that 9? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have Florida State at 8. Some people have Florida State even higher than that. I've seen Florida State in the top 4. But the point is, both of these teams are getting a lot of attention this offseason, a lot of hype around both of these programs and both of these teams heading into 2023. So unlike last offseason, this game's getting a ton of attention all offseason long this year, and I think it deserves it. It's going to be a great game. And this could be a bellwether game for both teams in terms of their outlook for 2023, right? It was a great game last year. Florida State ended up winning, sort of a last-minute deal. Both teams went on to have good seasons, but it sort of feels like, now, when you talk about playoffs this time of year, it's kind of hard to do that. With a 14 playoffs, hard to get into. But LSU and Florida State, I think if you were to, let's say you were to make a list of 10 to 15 teams that you think legitimately have at least some kind of shot at getting to the playoffs, I think both LSU and Florida State would be somewhere on that list of 10 to 15 teams. So whoever loses this game, while technically not eliminated from any playoff race, I mean, whoever loses this game, they could go, they could run the table, finish 11-1, win their conference, and make the playoffs. But the loser of this game, in my opinion, is likely to lose at least one other game. In other words, if LSU can't beat Florida State, they're probably losing a couple more games on their schedule too. If Florida State can't beat LSU, same thing is true. So while this is not technically a playoff elimination game, whoever loses this game is going to be getting a lot less steam as heading into the season in terms of being a legitimate playoff contender. I think it's a huge game, and I'm expecting it to be a great game. Florida State brings a ton back, the most returning production of any Power 5 team in the country. LSU, a couple of quarterbacks that looked good at different times last year with Jaden Daniels, kind of the running threat. Nussmeier looked good when he played, particularly in the second half of the SEC title game against Georgia. They've got NFL players all over the field, LSU does. Talent's never been a problem with LSU. So going to be a really, really good game to kick things off there in what's technically a neutral site game, Florida State versus LSU. Another non-con game coming up for the Corn Dogs after that against Grambling. That's week 2. Then they start their conference play. They do have 2 more non-con games, though, later in the season, towards kind of the middle of the season. Is that October 21st? They host Army, and then late in the year, they host Georgia State. So if you compare that to last year's schedule, it's pretty similar. Of course, they played Florida State last year. They play them again this year. That's their only Power 5 non-con opponent each of the last 2 years. They played UAB last year, a decent group of 5 team. The other 2 non-con games were kind of, nobody type games. This year they play Army. Army has good years from time to time. They run an offense that's hard to prepare for, especially when you have to play them in the middle of the season, which LSU does. And we'll talk more about that when we start to go through the schedule. But preparing for that triple option in 1 week is not easy to do. And then Georgia State to finish things up. So the non-con schedules are actually pretty comparable. The main difference, really, in my mind, is that it's basically an away game at Florida State this year, as opposed to last year being basically a home game. New Orleans last year, Orlando this year, but that's the non-con. All right, so week 3, you start your conference schedule on the road at Mississippi State. Mississippi State, of course, unfortunate situation there, losing Mike Leach at the end of last season, passed away unexpectedly. They promoted Arnett from the staff to head coach, and although they promoted from within, it's going to be a totally different Mississippi State team than what we're used to seeing. It's already been reported, and I believe Arnett has even come out and said they're sort of ditching the air raid style of offense. So I do not expect to see Mississippi State throwing the ball 55 or 60 times a game this season, which is what we became accustomed to under Mike Leach. So I think it's going to be kind of a transition year for Mississippi State. I don't expect a whole lot out of them, and even though this is on the road, probably not enough cowbell. You got to imagine LSU will be favored in that one. Come back home for your first home conference game against Arkansas. Another team that is sort of in do-over mode this year. They lost a ton to the portal and a ton of their coaches. Now, you can say they underperformed last year, so losing all those players and coaches is a good thing. And maybe it will be, particularly in the long run, but it's hard to imagine turning over. I think they are changing out something like 7 of their 10 on-field coaches. Now, the head coach is back, Sam Pittman, and I'm a huge Sam Pittman fan. But they're changing out, I believe, 7 of their 10 on-field coaches, and they lost 20-something players to the portal. Now, they brought some players in through the portal as well, and KJ Jefferson does return at quarterback, and he can be dangerous when he gets going. But it just seems to me the sort of hype that was around Arkansas maybe entering the last 2 seasons seems to be muted this year, and I think there's good reason for that. Just a lot of turnover there. So I think you catch a pretty good draw here with your first conference games being Mississippi State and Arkansas, 2 teams that are basically in do-over mode from last year. Tough road game coming up after that, though, on the road at Ole Miss. Ole Miss has a carousel of quarterbacks to choose from, all of which are pretty good. They brought Spencer Sanders in. They have your guy, Corn Dog Man, Walker Howard, transferred there from LSU. And, of course, they've still got Jackson Dart from last year. have a feeling Spencer Sanders is going to be kind of the main guy, the starter, but look, Lane Kiffin is unorthodox. He's not afraid to try different things. I wouldn't be surprised if we see multiple quarterbacks this year at Ole Miss, and they should have another dominating ground game. They led the SEC in rushing last year. Wouldn't surprise me to see them do it again. They've got that Judkins at running back, who you can make the case was the best running back in the SEC last year as a true freshman. He comes back. It's going to be fun to watch. It always is, that Lane Kiffin offense. They've got some questions on defense, but a tough game there on the road at Ole Miss. Back-to-back road games, because after that you got to travel to Missouri. That's the bad news, back-to-back road games. Good news is it's Missouri. Drinkwitz is going to his 4th year, I believe. He's had a 500 record every single year at Missouri. Just not getting it done. You just can't tread water at 500. It's one thing to go 10-2 year after year after year after year after year. That's technically treading water too. You can't be treading water at 6-6 every single year. They did bring a quarterback in from Miami, Mizzou did, and I'm assuming it's going to be his job. I mean, I know heading into spring practice, I believe he's the only quarterback on the roster that's even healthy. That Garcia from Miami. Not a very good team, though, Missouri, and this is on the road. You play there, but to be honest, Missouri has one of the smallest home field advantages in all of the SEC, in my opinion. Vandy and Mizzou, I think, two of the worst home field advantages. You got to imagine LSU will be a big favorite there. Then you come home and play Auburn. Third team you're playing this year that I would consider to be sort of in redo or rebuild mode. Mississippi State earlier in the year, and Arkansas back-to-back, and now, of course, Auburn. Brand new head coach Hugh Freeze. Now, he's got a ton of SEC experience, right? You know that. You used to play him every year when he was the head coach at Ole Miss. And he had some decent seasons. He had some big wins, beating Bama a couple of times. Got ran out of the league for a recruiting scandal and the whole the cell phone prostitute deal there. Wasted a couple of years at Liberty. Now the door's been back opened. He's back in the SEC at Auburn, taking over for just a disastrous couple of years under Brian Harsin there. Whatever you think about Auburn and their roster and the talent level, and even Hugh Freeze for that matter, it's a clear upgrade over Brian Harsin. So Auburn is going to be immediately better than they were last year, just in the fact that they've got Hugh Freeze as head coach and not Brian Harsin. Now, you get them at home. This is an advantage. I talked about Missouri not having a very good home field advantage. Auburn's got one of the tougher home field advantages in all of college football. So you get them at home. That's a good draw there. I think that could be a good game this year. I wouldn't sleep on Auburn. I think they're going to be one of the most improved teams in the SEC, at least record-wise, right? Now, they were so bad last year, it's hard not to improve. Them and Texas A&M both, I think, are going to be significantly better record-wise than they were last year. But you get them at home, so a good draw there. Then the Army game at home that I talked about. Now, look, Auburn is always a physical team, particularly along the defensive front. They're always a physical team. It's possible you come out of that Auburn game a little bit beat up, and then you've got to prepare all week long to go against Army in that triple option, which is never easy to do. We have seen Army beat good Power 5 teams, and we've seen them come close to beating a lot more good Power 5 teams. The Oklahoma game a few years ago comes to mind when they were sort of at the peak of their run under Lincoln Riley. This is not an easy situation here for LSU to have to play Army after that Auburn game. Now, LSU will be a significant favorite. Of course, you should beat Army, but man, I just can tell you, I would not want to be playing Auburn in the middle of an SEC season. I wouldn't want to be playing Army in the middle of an SEC season. I think, LSU will be a significant favorite, but dangerous game. Then you get a bye week before what will probably be the biggest game of the year for LSU on the road at Alabama. Yeah, you beat Bama last year, and that was great. That was at home. Alabama's been struggling on the road for 2 or 3 years now. Playing them there, totally different animal. Now, they've got a lot of question marks entering 2023. Probably more questions for Bama than any year I can remember, at least under Nick Saban heading into a season. Don't know what they're going to do at quarterback. Jalen Milroe did not look good to me last year when he played. They've got Ty Simpson on the bench, kind of waiting in the wings. We're in the middle of spring practice now. Those two guys are kind of dueling it out. We'll see which direction Alabama ends up going. But on top of losing Bryce Young and having questions at quarterback, of course, they lose Jahmyr Gibbs, probably their best offensive player last year, not named Bryce Young. He's gone to the NFL. A lot of receivers come back at Alabama, but the problem with that is none of them were any good last year. They led the SEC in drops. They just the drop-off in wide receiver talent at Alabama sure did happen in a hurry. They're going to have to find some playmakers there in 2023. And at running back, again, Jace McClellan. They've got a couple of freshmen that I like, but a lot of questions offensively. Yep, sorry about that. Amber Alert came through on my phone. Amber Alert shuts everything down when that comes through. Anyway, you look over on the defensive side of the ball. Questions there, too. They lose Will Anderson, which we were told heading into last year was the best player in all of college football, and that ended up not being the case, but still, an impact player. You're losing him. You lose Henry Toto. He's been Alabama's leading tackler the last couple of years. Pretty good in the secondary. Dallas Turner comes back, and you already know, Alabama's the most talented roster in the country, at least in terms of recruiting rankings and things like that. So it's not that they don't have the talent. They got a lot of questions and a lot of holes to fill heading into 2023. But this will be a huge game on the road at Alabama coming off your bye week. That one's on November 4th. Then your game against Florida. Is this game going to go away or not? We'll see. The permanent SEC schedule should be announced pretty soon. There's been a couple of lists floating around that are rumored to be accurate. LSU and Florida have been playing every year for a long, long time now. Chance that game goes did I say LSU and Auburn? LSU and Florida. I think you know what I meant. LSU and Florida have been playing for a long, long time. Chance that game goes away. But we're going to see it this year. And when I say goes away, with the new SEC schedule, you're going to be playing every team every other year. So even though you might not be playing them every year, you'll still be playing them. Might just be every other year. But you get them at home. Florida, another team, kind of rebuilding and starting over. Disastrous first season for Billy Napier there. Quarterback situation is a hot mess. Anthony Richardson went off to the NFL. Their backup quarterback's in jail on child pornography charges. They bring Graham Mertz in because the third-string quarterback who played in the bowl game, that jack leg, he was just absolutely horrible. One of the worst Power 5 quarterbacks I've seen in a game in a long, long time. Graham Mertz, of course, hold my beer type of deal. He's pretty bad, too. You bring him in from Wisconsin. Not looking good for Florida at the running back situation. They lose 4 of their 5 offensive linemen from last year's team. And the one bright spot for Florida last year was their ability to run the ball, right? Now, a lot of that had to do with Anthony Richardson, but I like their running backs, too. But no playmakers on the outside that scare anybody. Deficient on defense last year. Got to get a lot better there. You would assume LSU would be a favorite in this game. It's at home, so the most difficult part about that Florida game might be the fact that it's right after Alabama. But you wrap up with that, and then you've got that Georgia State game we talked about earlier, your last non-con game of the year at home, and then Texas A&M, which surprisingly is a revenge game for LSU from last year. Still don't know how you lost to Texas A&M last year. They were horrendous. That was probably the second most embarrassing loss of the season for LSU last year. The Tennessee thing. Tennessee was better than LSU. It's not embarrassing that you lost to Tennessee, but my God, didn't it beat you by 50 or something? That game was over 5 minutes in. It was a home game for you too, Corn Dog Man. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Anyway, you wrap things up with Texas A&M. Like Auburn, a team I think is going to be a lot better this year, at least record-wise. Bobby Petrino comes in to supposedly run the offense for Jimbo Fisher. We'll see if Jimbo actually lets him run it or not. But Texas A&M's another team that's got a ton of talent. That's why it's so funny that they were horrible last year. If Vandy goes 5-7, it's not funny. Vandy's a 5-7 roster. Texas A&M goes 5-7. Yeah, you laugh. Why? Because that's not a 5-7 roster. They're one of the 4 or 5 most talented teams in the country. So if they can get it together, particularly offensively, Texas A&M's got the potential to be a really good team. Problem is they've had the potential to be a really good team year after year after year after year for what seems like forever, and they're never able to do it. You do get them at home, again, a benefit. So last 3 games of the year at home, Florida, Georgia State, and Texas A&M, probably be favored in all of those. We'll see. Anyway, that's the LSU schedule for 2023. Shout out to my new best friends over at TigerShit.com. Boy, you guys sure know how to make somebody feel welcome. Have a great day.